Morning, everybody. Just give me a second. I gotta adjust the lights here. That's better. Okay, we're nice and bright. Hope you're doing well this morning. As you can see, I'm being joined by a bunch of doggies in the back that are running in slow motion, but they're pretty cute. So let's keep them on there. Okay. So as you know, you do have an exam and it will be available for you to start taking tonight at midnight if you are so inclined. I imagine most of you will want to wait a little bit and take it during better hours, but it will be available to you between midnight tonight and midnight Sunday. So I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll first post all the information about the exam, and then I'll take a couple of seconds to see if there's any questions, and then we'll continue with our lecture. So let's go ahead and do that. Everything will work here. Yeah, good. Cool. Okay, things are working better today than they did last week. All right. Oops. Somewhat better. There I am. Okay, great. So between 12 a.m. So I guess that's officially tomorrow, but midnight tonight through Sunday at midnight, and it can be taken during any 80-minute period. It is timed. A few of you have extra time because you've registered with SDRC or whatever, and I will make sure that the iLearn program takes that into account. You will be given the extra time if you have that on file with them. So don't worry about that. The program does it automatically. Okay. It is open book, as you know. You can use your notes. You can use the book itself, any slides, whatever. But it must be taken alone. And again, do remember that this is something you do need to study for. It's just because it's open book doesn't mean that you don't have to prepare for it. 80 minutes is not enough to look up the answer to all 60 questions. So you should come prepared. And yes, you will be able to look up the questions that you have problems with, but hopefully by studying, you won't have that many problems with that many questions, and you'll have extra time to do that. Okay. Again, we've done this since we've been on quarantine. We've done it this style, open book, online, and all that, and people have done very well. So as long as you study, you should do very well. Okay. It just as a reminder, it covers all the course material through. I think it's going to be about I think I'll be done with today's taste material within half an hour, 45 minutes. Hopefully, not much longer than that. And we'll start moving into touch. Touch is not on your exam. It's everything through taste. I'll let you know when we come to that. I'll remind you that from the touch material on, that will be stuff that's tested on the final exam. Okay. Discussion section material was through Monday. Yesterday's discussion material, as I understand it, was on something. It was on touch probably. And so it won't be tested on this exam. It will be tested on the final as well. And that's all the chapter material, book material through chapter 5. Do remember to read all that. There will be questions derived from the text that were neither covered in lecture or in discussion section. So it's important that you go over that material as well, including the preface. There's a couple of questions derived from the preface, which I did not discuss. Okay, let's see if there's any questions. Let's take a little break from the sharing and see if there's questions. And you can chime in by speaking or post something on chat if you have any questions about the exam. No? Nothing? You're all happy? Okay, I'm glad to hear you're happy, or to infer you're happy from your silence. Let's see if there's anything else. No, all right. No chats. I assume everyone can hear me okay, and you let me know if you couldn't. All right, I will take your silence as confidence. All good, says Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie. All right, Then let's go ahead and continue our discussion. And boy, I really love this material. I love all this material. What can I say? Um, I wouldn't have put it in the book if I didn't love it. But I just think this is such an interesting topic. And the reason I think it's so interesting is because it is a type of perceptual expertise that I think, oops, make sure this is back here. Sorry. I've got two screens and sometimes I get a little confused in coordinating them. There we go. Let's just do that. Yeah, okay. It is a perceptual expertise, Stephen Poe, that I think is really interesting. So we've discussed different types of perceptual expertise throughout the quarter. I was one of the topics of the course is can we understand things from meeting these perceptual experts about our own brains, about how perception works in general, about how sound works, about how sight and smell and taste work. And we met a number of people, and you met a lot more in the book. A lot of this, a lot of the insight we gained was from understanding how they were able to perform the skills they were able to perform. The thing about the wine tasters, these master sommeliers, is they are in fact improving their skills, their perceptual skills, by basically explicit learning, basically sitting down with books and learning about detailed information as if they were studying for a test. And that's an interesting way to establish a perceptual expertise. I mean, yes, they do a lot of tasting. They have to, taste all the different wines, but it wouldn't be enough just to kind of, taste wines and try to remember things about the flavors of the wine. They have to learn about, the production techniques. They have to learn about how the grapes are grown and what strain of grapes they're using and all that sort of stuff in order to perform these skills. And just to remind you what these skills are, these master sommeliers are very, very few and far between. I mean, probably, so there's 269 or more or less in the world right now, but a lot more people try out to be the master sommeliers. I mean, we're talking about thousands and thousands, but it takes a very long time, and not that many are able to pass. As we discussed, they learn things about wine theory and servant decorum. They're actually given tests about those things. But the one that's really challenging, the test that's most challenging, that is most relevant to what we discussed in the course, is this blind tasting, where they have to sit there at a table with 6 different wines that are unlabeled. They're in glasses. They're all reds, most likely. Sip each wine, and within 25 minutes, identify the wine, basically, and identify the details of the wine. The grape variety, the region that the grape was grown in, and it can be a region from all over the world. I mean, we're talking about Australian wines, we're talking about, of course, California wines, and French wines. So they have to know something about, each vineyard location, and the vintage. What year was the wine with the grapes grown in, and then the wine bottled in. And they have 25 minutes to do this. And as I mentioned last class, they are rated on whether they can, actually identify the wines, but they have to do more than that. They have to describe their experience of the wine as they're sipping it. Okay, they have to go through very detailed description of the wine. And then as they kind of reach their conclusions about what the wine is, by identifying it, they have to give their reasoning behind it. So yes, they have to get very close in all these different dimensions, but just as important, they have to give their logic behind why it tastes the way it does and why they're identifying it the way they are. And they're doing this in 25 minutes while sitting in front of 3 masters who have already passed the test and have kind of, established themselves for, years of teaching other sommeliers, as these masters do. So it's very high pressured. And Steve Poe said he failed 3 times. I think it was his 3rd or 4th time where he eventually passed, but he said it is a really, really challenging and difficult test. I did post something directly from the book here to give you a sense of what his experience was like when he did pass. He was basically running out of time, and he had identified 5 of the wines and felt like he had done a good job. Yeah, they don't tell you at that point whether you're correct or not, but he felt pretty confident in how he had done with those five wines, and he was working on the last one. He describes it like this. I remember that I was working to identify the last of my 6 wines. Time was running out. I had looked at the wine's legs, and by the way, what that is, just in case you're unfamiliar with some of these terms, the wine's legs are like when you swish the wine around in a glass. The liquid actually kind of slowly drips down on the inside of the glass, and that can tell you something about the sugar content, about the alcohol content, and that is a nice piece of information to kind of help narrow what the wine might be. I inhaled his bouquet, you know what that is, and taken a sip. I was trying to describe it as if it were some overripe Cabernet Syrah blend, probably from Australia. So Cabernet and Syrah, I guess, are different types of wines. And he thought it was from Australia, but something just didn't seem quite right. I thought again about its characteristics. It was a little bit off dry. I think I can understand what that is, even though I'm not a wine drinker, right? I know what dry versus sweet means, kind of. It was big, meaning it had a very kind of strong flavor. There weren't a lot of subtleties in it. It had high alcohol, which I could also imagine tasting. I think, to the degree I'm a kind of, beer lover, I can taste when a beer has more or less alcohol. It can be a very, kind of identifiable flavor. And I assume that is the same in wine. It had spiciness. I can kind of understand what that might be like. Like it kind of has a peppery flavor to it, and tastes a little of dried raisins. And then it just clicked. I thought, oh my gosh, this is an Amarone. That's a type of wine from Veneto, Italy. It was just one of those situations where the studying and the focus just took over. And this is what I'm trying to describe about these type of perceptual specialists. They establish their specialty by basically spending years reading about wine as they're sipping that wine. So, they'll go out and buy, tons of wine from different regions, that are considered kind of, the typical wine from that region. And then, buy books, take books out of the library that describe, the history of those specific wines they've purchased, the production techniques, how the grapes are grown, that sort of thing, and read about that as they're sipping. They'll say, okay, well, using this type of grape gives the flavor this, this, and this. So they'll sip and see if they have that type of flavor. If they can train themselves to detect that type of flavor, right? So it is, kind of like going out and studying for an exam in some ways, but it's studying for an exam that's tested through, a perceptual process. In this case, it's taste. So it is, really kind of learning, getting knowledge about things. And that knowledge is then allowing them to fine-tune their perceptual skill. And this is the first time I think we've really talked about a perceptual expertise that is fine-tuned by knowledge, by book learning, right? Which I think is so interesting. I do have a little video clip of somebody who is practicing for the tasting, Master Sommelier tasting part of the exam. I think you'll find interesting. Let's go ahead and do that. And I hopefully be able to hear it okay. And you'll see what the process is like. And then we'll come back and talk about some of the science behind this.
Cheese rind, honey. Lots of honey. Wine is off dry. Medium intensity. Medium body. Frame of the wine, acidity is high. Tannin low. Alcohol, medium. Fruits have changed a little bit on the palate. I'm getting some apricot, peach notes, a little stone fruit, along with the lemon lime. And that Meyer lemon is converted into key lime. The quality is medium. Final conclusion: Chenin, France, Loire. Put this at Vouvray, Demi, Sec, and Vintage. Again, 2009. Wine number 3 is white wine.
Yeah, so in this case, he was correct. And you can tell that, I mean, look at the detail he's actually providing there in the tasting, and you can see the way he's describing it. He's got to know so much about wine and so much about the production details in order to get this far. And then he has to do this with, how many thousands of wines there are. He doesn't necessarily have to get the brand vintage, but he does have to get the region where it's grown and the type of grape and the year, the likely year. And that the year is going to, the way they are able to infer the year is once they've established what type of wine it is, where it's from and all that, the grape, they then know that certain years had a wetter climate or a cooler climate, and that has a very strong influence on how the wine tastes if you're a connoisseur, right? That some years were wetter than others in that region of France. And therefore it will have, maybe an influence on the sweetness of the wine, but I'm sure there's a lot of other dimensions of the wine that it has influences on as well. Okay, so what about the science? So, it's interesting that, wine experts have been one of the most studied types of perceptual experts. So, certainly it's the case that individuals who are blind and then learn to use their hearing and touch in kind of interesting ways, that those folks have been studied too. But in terms of, like professions or hobbies or something like that, that doesn't involve a sensory loss, in terms of perceptual expertise, it probably is wine experts, because it really is thought that they are, able to kind of educate themselves into a new perceptual experience, which is really cool. I mean, it'd be fun to be able to do that. I imagine, musicians do that to some degree. If you learn about music, you probably hear things, but, the fact that you can do it with taste, I think is really, kind of a tantalizing idea for scientists. So what's going on with these folks once they establish themselves as experts? Does something change on their tongue? Does something change maybe at the, the level of, the peripheral taste system or something like that? So they study these folks and study them in, very systematic ways in the laboratory, and they compare, wine experts to the non-experts like me to see what the differences are. And the differences might not be exactly how you would guess they might be. So, for example, say, Stephen Poe and I am brought to the laboratory, and we're both subjected to the same test. The first one is whether, there's a, say we're both given, we're blindfolded, and we're given a glass of water that has a tiny, tiny bit of wine in it. And the question is, it either has or doesn't have a tiny bit of wine in it. We're talking about like an eyedropper, a couple of drips of it. Is Stephen able to detect that there's wine in a glass of water before I am? And that's called like their taste threshold. Is he able to taste that a wine taste is present in a glass of water before I am? And the answer is no. So his threshold for detecting the presence of wine is no better than mine as a wine novice, right? Or anybody else, like you folks who may not, maybe you are wine experts, I don't know. But if you're not, Stephen Poe's ability to detect wine in a glass of water is no better than you. And it's the same thing for the ability to discriminate between the wines. So, we're still blindfolded and two glasses are put in front of us, and they're either they're either the exact same wine or one of them is a glass of similar wine, but it's also been a little bit of another wine has been added to it. And the question is, how much of that other wine needs to be added to that second glass for you to notice a difference? And the same thing is true there with Stephen Poe. He is no better at saying, oh yeah, now I can taste that this glass is a little different from this glass of wine. He's no better at that than you and I are. So that what we're saying here is wine experts actually have no better taste thresholds or discriminative abilities for wine. So it's not like their tongue is more sensitive in a way. It's not like that at all. And this isn't just true of tasting wines. This is also true of smelling wines, because you would absolutely think that if he's having to evaluate wines through smell when it comes to that tasting part of the master sommelier test, that he would in fact be able to do this better. Because it's one thing that I'm not great at determining wines, or I don't know very much about wine when I taste it, but my ability to smell wines and identify it based on smell would be really worse than that. And so Stephen might be better than that, but that's not the case either. If the same types of tests are done, not with asking whether you can taste if there's a tiny bit of wine or in a glass of water, and he smells it rather than tastes it, he can't do any better than you and I can. The same with discriminating. If it's the two glasses of the same wine, but they then add a little bit of a different wine into that second glass, can he tell by smell? And the answer is not any better than you and I can. In fact, he's subject. We talked about this. There is this well-known thing, I talk about it in the book, called the wine color illusion. And I'm sure I would be fooled by this. You can take a glass of white wine and add red food coloring to it, and I would probably have a different type of set of descriptions that would, of the wines. In other words, you can fool somebody. It's called the wine color illusion. You can fool somebody into believing that they're drinking a red wine, and then their experience of it actually is a little different. They'll say, "Oh, if I had to describe it, I'd say it tastes more like plums or more raisiny or something like that." Things that are associated with red wine flavors rather than white wines, which are often described as more grassy, maybe more lemony, that sort of thing. And so you can fool a novice into thinking they're drinking a red wine based on changing the color of it. So I say in the book, if you have wine drinkers but not wine experts in that love red wine, and you only have white wine in the house, grab your red food coloring and you should be able to fool them okay. And I talked to Stephen about this, and I said, do you think you'd be fooled? And he said, well, to some degree, yeah, maybe it would taste like a very strange red wine, but I think the color is such an important part of the process for us. We're trained to really, really use the color of the visible color of the wine to identify what it is. I could imagine it would fool us to some degree for some time. And so these folks, these experts, could also be fooled like that. But they are different. I mean, absolutely, they're different, but they're not different kind of on a superficial level. What they're different with is how their brain responds when they drink wine. So when they sip wine, okay, they have a very different brain response. First of all, areas where smell and taste converge are much more activated in wine experts than they are in novices like you and me, okay, for me at least. What else? Well, when they take a sip of wine, experts show a very strong response in the left hemisphere. So what is this? I don't want you to worry too much about this, but if you've learned a little bit about brain areas, you might have learned along the way that the left hemisphere, so we can divide the brain, yeah, just like this. These images are showing here of these brain scans. You can divide the brain right down the middle. Oops, sorry, I'm having trouble controlling this. Yeah, right down the middle like this. And for right-handed people, the left side of the brain is considered to be kind of the more analytic. So we use it for language, we use it for mathematical skill, where the right side of the brain is used more more often for face perception, for spatial representation, that sort of thing. It's always much more complicated than that. But there do seem to be some advantages in the left hemisphere for analysis and advantages in the right hemisphere for space, that sort of thing. And you do find, maybe this is unsurprising, you do find in these experts that their left hemisphere activity is much greater than those of us that aren't experts. And it's likely what this is reflecting is that when an expert sips a wine, they show more kind of analytical processes as they're sipping, okay? I see there's another comment there, and I'll get to it in just a second. Let me just finish off the slide and we'll get to it. There's also what you find is in the left hemisphere, greater activation in areas that are presumably associated with memory and language, which turns out to be really, really important. So when they sip, when experts sip, unlike you and I, they show greater left hemisphere activity. And within that left hemisphere, they show areas of memory and language being more activated than you and I, okay? So this kind of goes along with the idea that, you know, they kind of almost reflexively start this kind of analysis of the wine that kind of brings in their past experience with the wine. And I think importantly, you know, kind of accesses their descriptive knowledge of the wine. That's where probably the language areas are coming into play. So when they sip, it's like they access, you know, this kind of giant encyclopedia of, you know, wine terms and wine knowledge just in general. So really what's going on here, you know, based on their you know, kind of book learning, you know, based on them getting this explicit knowledge about wine and wine production techniques and all that sort of stuff, is they have a very sophisticated conceptual understanding, okay, of wine and a very, very rich descriptive language to use to help identify the wine. And they access that as soon as they sip. We don't, or I don't, as a non-expert, right? So it's not kind of the superficial aspects of wine tasting that they are better at. It's kind of the deeper stuff. And that deeper stuff, though, then allows them to bring that knowledge to help them kind of identify different types of flavors that might be in the wine, okay? So this is a good time for me to look quickly at this chat question. Okay, Ivy asks, how do we research taste when everyone tastes differently? I would think that it can create a lot of error and add another variable. Yeah, taste is tough. You know, you know, especially since we all have different, you know, kind of experience of taste. You know, I have one son that you know, hates tomato, and another one that loves tomato, so all that sort of thing. But I think when it comes to these very low level things, like trying to detect whether there's a sugar in water or salt in water or wine in water, or whether two things taste exactly the same or they taste a little different. Certainly you're going to find individual differences, right? But you know, the question is whether you find big individual differences with experts like wine drinkers versus non-wine drinkers. And so there are ways of doing it, you know, kind of methodically and carefully that really don't necessarily tap into people's kind of preferences in flavor. Okay, and that's also true. That would be true of anything in some ways, right? You know, people have different tastes in music, and there's ways of testing, you know, their hearing ability with different types of sounds that, you know, would be so low level that you'd find a lot of consistency between people, even though their audio preferences are different. It's the same type of thing, but it's a good question. You're right. There does seem to be something kind of so subjective about flavor that it would be a hard thing to do. But, you know, they do find ways that are pretty systematic. You know, people are pretty close when it comes to being able to detect sugar in water or salt in water or even wine in water. So despite their preferences of flavor and even despite their their experience with wine or cooking or something like that? It's a very good question. Okay, let's go ahead and see a nice example of this. So this is what we're after here. It's becoming a perceptual expert by gaining this explicit kind of like book learning knowledge, and how that then bears on the abilities, these amazing abilities they have to identify a wine through tasting it. Okay, I think you're going to find this really interesting. He gave me a great example of this. So he said, what happens is that when you're learning about the production techniques of a wine, you learn that those production techniques create not just, kind of a heightened sweetness, or, maybe, I don't know, an oaky flavor or something like that. The production techniques create what he calls constellations of flavor, meaningful constellations of flavor. In other words, once he kind of has a sense of what the wine might be, or where it's from, or what type of grape it is, he can taste it again and look for other type of flavors that are associated with that production technique, right? So the idea is, take one sip and you get some idea based on the sweetness and things like that. And then you think about it in a while and say, okay, so I tasted sweetness and oakiness and maybe raisiness. What types of wines across the world have those constellation of flavors? And then what other dimensions are part of those constellations? And he'll sip again, think, okay, maybe this is a specific type of wine. But if it is, not only will it have, oaky, sweet, and raisiny, it should also have a little bit of sourness to it if it is in fact that wine that's produced in that way. And he'll taste it again and say, yep, it's got the sourness. Now I'm really narrowing down where that wine is from. Okay, so he gave this great example, malolactic fermentation, which I guess is a type of secondary fermentation. After the wine gets its alcohol, you can ferment it again in some kind of clever way. And it really doesn't give it much more alcohol. What it does is it really kind of adds flavor. And there's ways of doing this. I know they do this with beers now too. It's a kind of very well-known technique. However, it's not done everywhere. Okay, it's done. Historically, it's been done just in very specific regions, in France, for example. So, the constellations, he told me, that are associated with malolactic fermentation are buttery texture. I can imagine what that is. So I'm always trying to imagine if I might be able to taste these things. So it feels really smooth on the tongue. I think I could get that. Sauerkrauty, okay. I know what sauerkraut tastes like, right? You're going to get a lot of flavor kind of in the back of the mouth because of the kind of sourness. Kind of it's what sour is like. And a yogurt flavor, that I think I might have a little bit more trouble identifying in a wine. I'm not sure I would do that. To me, it would, well, maybe it'd be a little bit overlapping with the sauerkraut if it were kind of like a plain yogurt flavor versus a sweet yogurt flavor. It might be a little like sauerkraut. Anyway, he can do it. All right, he can taste these different things. And so if he takes a sip, if he's in his exam and he takes a sip and he says, okay, there's the buttery texture, and there's a little sauerkraut flavor, and he puts his wine down. By the way, what they're doing in between, they during the test, during the learning, they do drink the wine, but they've got to be pretty sober to do well. So they do a lot of spitting out of the wine, and they always take sips of water in between to kind of clean their tongue, to cleanse their palate, as they say. And so he'll sip the wine and say, okay, there's the buttery texture, there's the sauerkraut. I wonder if the wine has gone through malolactic fermentation. He said, well, if that's the case, I shouldn't just taste buttery and sauerkraut. I should also taste that yogurt. Let me cleanse my palate and taste that wine again and see if I can taste the yogurt. Yep, there it is. I bet you anything this is a wine that's gone through malolactic fermentation. And so now he narrows it down to a certain region, or maybe collection of regions in France, and then starts over again and sees, okay, what else is in there? It's really cool. I mean, it is it is, you know, kind of contingent. It's based on him learning about what malolactic fermentation does to the flavor of wine, basically. And this is the basis of their superior recognition performance. You know, it's cool. It's very, very cool that, you know, it's kind of bringing their intellect into their sensory experience, right? Then you can understand now why people kind of get so into this. It's kind of a really neat matching of you know, explicit knowledge as a hobby, and then how that changes, you know, a very sensual experience, essentially, right? And you know, I can understand the appeal. And he said, yeah, this is it. This is where you know, this the heart of where this is what I want to share, said Stephen Poe. You know, remember I talked to you about what he was like, and you know, he wasn't a wine snob. He wasn't making fun of people that didn't like wine. You know, I told him you know, I'm a beer drinker, and he said, as long as you enjoy it, that's great. And say, but I love wine so much. I love this matching of the intellect and the kind of sensual experience. I want to share that. I want people to know what it's like. You know, this is the sort of stuff he loves. And so, you know, when it comes to, you know, doing other sorts of tasks in the laboratory, you know, for example, you know, grouping wines. So say you get like you know, you're in the laboratory as a non-wine expert. I go to the laboratory as a non-wine expert, and there's 10 wines there. And you're told, okay, what we want you to do is group these wines based on their flavor into 3 or 4 different groups. I'll say, okay, I'll take sips of each of these. And I'll say, okay, these are all kind of sweet. These are all a little bit less sweet. These are medium sweet. You know, I mean, it would be a really, really kind of almost random sort of categorization. This is where Stephen Poe and the wine experts really, really excel. They'll easily break it down into 3 or 4 different groups, and they'll have a very good reason. This is, you know, they'll say, okay, well, this is probably the French, you know, Cabernets or whatever. I mean, they'll do a really, really good job with this sort of thing. And then we come back the next week and they give us the same 10 wines, and I'm asked to do it again. And say, okay, these are the sweet ones. I wouldn't be very consistent, but boy, Stephen Poe comes back the next week and is asked to categorize the same wines. He does it exactly the same as he did the first time. So this is the similarity ratings, you know, categorizing wines, that sort of thing. This is really where they're excelling, not at being able to detect if there's a wine in water, or detect if there's a tiny, tiny difference in wine by putting another wine in the other one. However, when it comes to, you know, kind of categorizing real wines and doing it systematically over and over in the same way, there is no comparison. They excel so much at this sort of thing. So I got one more quote, and I think that, you know, it really kind of explains this better than I could in terms of the research. He says there's no question that the more knowledge you have, the more your tasting is informed. If you know, for example, that they use a tufa subsoil in the Anjou Saumur, that's an area in France, then when you're trying a Cabernet, getting that chalky, I can kind of imagine what that's like. Stony minerality, I guess, you know, a mineral flavor, maybe. I don't know what stony minerality means on the wine. You become confident that you're tasting a Cabernet Franc from the Loire Valley, probably Chinois. That's an area of the Loire Valley, I guess. And knowing this can draw your attention to other tastes associated with that region. Okay. So, you know, different regions, because of their climate, because of their soil, because of their history in producing wine, are going to produce different flavored wine. And, you know, we're not talking just about sweet versus tart versus something like that. We're talking about constellations of flavor. And that's what their book learning, that's what their expertise draws their attention to, so they can perform this. So they, you know, consciously are able to taste things that the expert is not able to taste, or that the non-expert is not able to taste. And this allows them to do this kind of, you know, kind of tasting test. Okay, cool. Let's just finish this off with one more just general quick discussion of other perceptual experts that are also informed by their kind of explicit understanding, by their intellectual understanding of something. So we continue with this. You taste what you understand. So other examples were explicit knowledge, reading, learning, kind of explicit experience can enhance perception. So the second most studied type of perceptual expertise after, certainly the sensory deprived folks are studied, as I said, but then wine experts are studied a lot. After that, it's probably chess experts. And, if you've seen this, well, I probably, a lot of you watched Queen's Gambit, right? And so you might have a sense of how this sort of thing works. Now, I think in Queen's Gambit, they do show her having a kind of maybe natural aptitude for what was going on, and that's certainly part of it. But they also show her experience, her having, to really push her learning and all that sort of stuff, which is important, certainly with expert chess players. And so what she could do, clearly, I don't know if there was a scene like this in the movie, but certainly you can go online and see videos of real chess players playing multiple players at the same time. They are able to memorize configurations of pieces on the board without much trouble, okay, without much problem. And so, if you go online, you can see chess experts maybe playing 10 people at the same time. It's pretty amazing. So they'll be in the middle maybe of a group of tables. There's, say 3 tables surrounding them, and there's 3 or 4 players and chessboards at each of these tables, and they're all playing the master at the same time. And you'll see the master going from board to board, but you'll also see the master sometimes not even looking at the board and telling the player to move a piece for them. So, the master might be really concentrating on this person over here because this person is really good. So they're spending a lot of time here looking at the pieces. But maybe the more novice chess players that are kind of just doing it for fun on this side, he doesn't have to worry about too much. So he'll, maybe just yell out as he's working on this board, he'll yell out, "Okay, Bill, if you don't mind moving my piece, move my pawn to King's 2 or King's Bishop 2 or something like that." So he knows how to move the piece for him. And he doesn't even need to look, or she doesn't even need to look back to determine where the pieces are. Here she will go with the Queen's Gambit. She has memorized the pieces on that board, and she's probably memorized the pieces on many of the boards. Needs to look every once in a while just to kind of reacquaint herself, but they are able to do this. They can memorize the piece configurations and can play without looking as they do that. However, it's interesting, this you would say that this is a type of perceptual expertise that they're able to remember the visual image of the pieces. And you can say, yes, this is true, but it is limited in this way. It only works if the positions of the pieces make sense based on the rules of chess. So, there are some very strict rules of chess. And if there are pieces on the board that really, so like, for example, you can't move your queen. Your queen can't jump over pieces. Your king can't jump over pieces either, right? It has to be a straight open line. If the queen, so you say if you guys play chess at all, if all your pawns are still in their initial position and the queen is out in front, that's violating the rule of chess, one of the rules of chess. Once you do that, a chess expert cannot memorize the board. Okay, so it is only if they are in true game positions, only if the pieces are in positions that they could be in given the rules of chess. So it's not just they're memorizing. It's not like they just have this amazing visual memory of the board. It's a visual memory that is, kind of contingent on, dependent on the pieces having arrived at their positions based on the actual rules of chess. They can't just be randomly scattered across the board or something like that. Okay. which makes some sense. And it is kind of similar, I think, as you'll see, to the wine experts too. If you start kind of messing with things with the wines and stuff like that, or give them tests that really kind of don't make a lot of sense in terms of what one knows about wine, or what is true about wine, then wine experts start, this isn't right. Anyway, back to these chess experts, back to the Queen's Gambit. I'm sure the character that's being portrayed has these skills, but again, it's dependent on the actual rules of chess being followed to get those pieces there. This sort of thing's been shown in the exact same way for other types of perceptual expertise, including coaches. So football coaches or soccer coaches, where they'll be able to memorize the positions of players. I guess basketball too, where the players should be, where they should go in order to enact a type of attack play or something like that. Musicians, when looking at scores, conductors especially, are able to remember, but looking at a score of music, is able to remember what each of the different instruments should be doing, at different parts of the piece. However, and circuit, the last one is circuit designers can memorize it very quickly, the circuit, the diagrams of circuits, and recreate them. And so it's the same type of thing as the Queen's Gambit, right? They're all able to do this based on their expertise. But again, it depends on their knowledge of soccer and music and circuit designing, all of which have rules, all of which are constrained by rules. And if the circuit or musical score or the play that's being represented on the chart deviates from those rules, then they're at a loss. They say, I don't know, I can't remember it because it's a nonsensical sort of musical score or a soccer play or circuit. I can't do that. They'd be like you and me when it comes to trying to memorize these things. So again, it is informed by their knowledge of the rule. It kind of facilitates somehow their visual memory, but it is dependent on those rules, which I think is really interesting. Back to our wine expert, back to someone like Stephen Poe. Let me now give you an example of an experiment that really kind of demonstrates this with regard to wine tasting. If you bring Stephen Poe in, and now they're not going to be tasting wine, they're just going to be memorizing word pairs that do have to do with wine. And I'm going to be the control group. I don't know nothing about wine terms, so I'm going to be what Steve Poe's results are going to be compared to. And here comes some terms. If the pairs of terms coming up on the computer screen are in fact meaningfully related, they'll do better at then recalling them later on. So for example, full-bodied and prune. Okay, Steve Poe his task is to memorize that term, and then later on he'll have to type in as many of the pairs that he can remember. Full-bodied prune would be one of them. Now, me trying to remember full-bodied and prune was in fact one of the pairs I probably wouldn't be very good at. It's might as well be words that had nothing to do with wine as far as I'm concerned. They could have been, like table and zebra or something like that. It's like, oh, I might be able to remember that one, but there's no reason I would necessarily remember that one better than any other ones. But boy, would he have no problem remembering that, because full-bodied and prune are flavors that often go together in a red wine. However, if the pair was instead full-bodied and lime, which are flavors that don't typically go together for wine. In fact, lime is very often used to describe a white wine, where full-bodied, like prune, is used to describe some type of red wine. Okay, he would do no better than me. He might as well at that point have gotten bed and zebra or something like that, right? So again, he has this ability, he has this advantage to memorize, words related to wine, but only if they are meaningfully related. If they are, if the relationship is not meaningful in terms of what he knows of wine, then he's going to do no better than me at this sort of thing. Okay. So they show these wonderful advantages, not only of sensory experience and identification of wines and identifications of chessboards and all this sort of thing, but it is, sensibly, it is dependent on what they've learned and what they've kind of integrated into their knowledge system to help them perceive things differently. It's really, really interesting. Okay, last topic I want to talk about in this context has to do with, I think, what's a really interesting phenomenon in general. It's a phenomenon called the verbal overshadowing effect. So what is the verbal overshadowing effect? This is a phenomenon discussed very often in the context of eyewitness, I guess, recognition of perpetrators. So this happened a long, long time ago to me. This was probably about 25 years ago. I was living in Riverside, and I went out to a restaurant with a friend in Moreno Valley. I'd be very surprised if that restaurant was there. It was kind of a little hole in the wall. It was a great little Italian restaurant in Moreno Valley, but it was kind of in the middle of nowhere. And we were getting out of the car, and these two guys run up to us. One of them with a gun, and points it at us and says, "Give me your wallet, give me your purse." And we did right away, and they ran away. Yeah, it was scary. It was very scary. And we go into the restaurant and call the police and all that sort of stuff. The restaurant was wonderful, by the way. They gave us free dinners and gave us drinks, which we could use at that point. It was a scary time. The police come in. They were very nice and very understanding of the whole kind of trauma of the situation and everything. But they asked for descriptions of the guys that held us up, and both my friend and I gave descriptions. And she was better at it than I was. I didn't. It's kind of hard to do. We finished our descriptions, and they get a call. They said, we just found two guys running from that location. They didn't have the purse or wallet on them, but given the initial descriptions that you gave us, it could have been them. And they said, "Do you guys want to see if it's them? Maybe we could find your wallet and your purse." And we said, "Sure." This is, by the way, it's called a show up. It's like a lineup, except you're only seeing the suspects, and it's done there, close to where the event took place. So the way that, I was kind of nervous about the whole idea that we would encounter these people again. They said, no, don't worry about it. They're going to be standing off in the distance. We're going to be shining a light at them. And it was night at this point. We're going to be shining a light towards them. They're not going to be able to see into the car at all. You're going to be sitting in back behind us anyway. And you just need to look at them and tell us whether or not they are the people that held you up. And so we did it. We get there. There are these two guys that do fit the description, kinda. And they shine the light on them. They, and they start smiling ear to ear, which was probably pretty smart on their part. People look very different when they smile. They were not smiling when they held us up. And the police said, "Can you be absolutely certain it's them?" My friend and I said, I don't think so. It kind of fits the description, but we can't be certain. And that's kind of an anecdote that just to kind of make this something you'll remember. It's absolutely all true, but it includes an example of what I'm discussing here, which is the fact that when my friend and I gave verbal descriptions of the perpetrators, it is likely we actually harmed our ability to just recognize them visually. And this is what the verbal overshadowing effect is. By giving a description of a face in this case, or the face and the body, it makes it harder for people just to straight recognize them. If in fact we had not given a verbal description, we might have been more confident that it was or wasn't them. It's a well-known sort of phenomenon in eyewitness testimony. It's kind of the most this is where this phenomenon is talked about the most in terms of a practical context. However, it also works in other contexts as well. Okay, so for smells and tastes, the same type of thing can happen. Okay, the most practical, the most known context is this eyewitness case, because it does have some bearing on eyewitness identification of suspects, that sort of thing. But it does happen in other contexts. Well, it happens in smells and tastes. So, for example, me as a casual wine drinker. Okay, I go back to the restaurant, I feel better, I'm not getting my wallet back, we had to cancel our credit cards, all that sort of stuff, but we're safe, we feel better, we drink wine. Let's pretend I probably drink beer, but I'll say we drink wine. And then I'm asked to describe the wine. So let's bring it to the lab. Okay, so I come into the lab, I take a sip of wine, and I am asked to describe the best I can. Say, okay, well, I'm not a wine expert, but I'll say it's a little sweet, and it's got a little kind of tartness, a tiny bit of tartness, and I can taste kind of raisins or something, and maybe this is the best I can do. I can taste maybe something like a woodsy flavor or something, or maybe like a grassy flavor, and that's the best I can do. Okay, and we write all these things down. Say, great, let's see if that then helps you remember that wine next week. So I come back next week, I'm given two wines that are not too different from each other. They're kind of from the same family. And I'm asked, which is the one you drank last week? And I would be a chance. I wouldn't know for certain. However, if I hadn't described the wines the week before, if I hadn't given that list of adjectives to describe the wines, I would have been better at identifying, saying, oh yeah, this is the one from last week. But when I gave that verbal description, it overshadowed my ability to recognize the wine. And that is absolutely true of me as a casual wine drinker. This, by the way, also works with tastes when it comes to desserts, when it comes to what else has it been tested with? It's like custards and ice creams and things like that. If you're asked to describe it as a non-expert, if you are asked to describe it, then it hurts your ability to recognize it later on. Like, oh yeah, this is the wine I had last week. This is the custard I had last week. If you were asked to describe it, you do worse than another group of subjects that were not asked to describe it. They would find it easier to recognize that wine or custard without it. That is true of the non-experts like me, casual wine drinkers. It does not, this overshadowing does not happen with wine when it comes to Stephen Poe. Okay, so you can imagine, I mean, this is maybe a little bit more intuitive. It doesn't inhibit Stephen Poe. So he comes into the same experiment, takes a sip of this wine and says, okay, go ahead and give us a description. And he does this amazing, wine's master sommelier description, right? And he just, just tons of adjectives on the sheet. And he said, I can also, by the way, say that it's probably bottled in 2009. And it does it. Okay, fine. Okay, he does it. Okay, then he comes back the next week, just like I had to. And he takes two sips, one of a wine the same wine he's had before, and the other one of a wine that's from the same family. It's not too different from it. And he's asked, which one is the one from last week? He'll say, obviously this one. He is not overshadowed by his verbal description. In fact, he probably does even better by giving a verbal description. So that is something else experts can show. It's kind of another way of tapping into this expertise. By the way, this is true of all types of these sensory experts, whether it's for taste, whether it's for wine. It's also like if you're a chef and you create custards maybe for either a restaurant or some sort of a grocery food chain or something like that. You're going to have that same experience. The expertise allows you to use a very rich verbal description that then doesn't overshadow it like it does for the non-experts. It, in fact, helps people remember. So it's a very different type of process. And so now we've kind of distinguished the kind of processes that are involved in this type of expertise as distinguished from the novice, from folks that aren't experts. And it doesn't, again, have to do with being able to detect wine, or even being able to make very fine discriminations about whether, you know, 2 glasses of the same wine have one of which has something added. I mean, that discrimination isn't really any better for the expert. It ends up having to do more with how their knowledge improves their kind of analytic, their descriptive skills with sipping wine. And that then allows them to identify wines as well as they can. Okay, cool. That ends our taste discussion. So right here, if you're taking notes, you might want to draw a big line and say that's everything for the midterm. We'll go ahead and switch the topic and give you a practice question. And let me also answer your chat questions. All right. Chat. Yeah, says that's so funny. Okay. I assume you're not talking about me being held up as funny? No, I'm sure.
No. When you were saying the suspects were smiling.
Yeah.
Like,
well,
clever.
it was very clever. I mean, you know, it was, I think, a bunch of things that they probably knew that, you know, when you smile, you look very different, but also if you smile, you look nicer, and it doesn't look like you can do anything. Boy, they look like nice people when they were smiling. So yeah, it really was very distracting. So you do remember more of what you say than what you actually taste and see. So do you remember more of, Crystal asked this, do you remember more of what you say than what you actually taste and see? That's a good question. So are you saying like, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just referring to the verbal overshadowing. I'm the way I'm thinking about it is,
yes.
Yes. You say something, and so like that overpowers what you actually taste. So
yeah, yes, you're absolutely right. That's a great question. You're absolutely right. Yes, okay. People. Well, it's kind of hard to compare, you know, just because the job of the actual taste recognition is whether this is the same wine or not. But they are also asked, do you remember some of the descriptors that you used last week? And people do remember a lot of those from the previous week. There's no question about that. You know, whether they're asked about those descriptors from the week before or not, the verbal overshadowing effect still occurs, if that's helpful. In other words, it's the verbal overshadowing occurs from the original description of the experience. It's not like, you know, being reminded of your description is going to be something that inhibits. It's the original description that seems to inhibit memory at that point. But yeah, people are able to remember, you know, much of the way they describe things, but, you know, it doesn't seem, even whether they are asked to remember that or not, doesn't seem to really affect the, you know, the fact that it's overshadowing. It's a really good question. Yeah. No, we haven't done any, this is our first practice question right now. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. So let's do one of our practice questions. Where do we leave off? Did we do food appearance last time? I can't remember. I think we did, right? Yes, we did. Maybe we didn't. No, we didn't. Okay, let me know. I'm assuming we didn't. Let me know if we did, though. This has to do with food appearance. Wait a second here. Yeah, let's just start with this one. Food appearance. Which, okay, thank you. Ivy doesn't remember this one. Okay, so let me know after you hear it, but I don't think we did do this. Which aspects of a food's appearance influences how it tastes? Which aspects of a food's appearance influence how it tastes? Its color, like if it's red versus orange, does that influence how it tastes? Color intensity, how bright the red is, for example. Its visible texture, or all of the above. I think it's pretty easy. Look back in your notes if you need to. Let's go ahead and launch it. How are we doing? We're doing very well. Okay, I'll give you another 20 seconds or so. Do this in the meantime. Good. Okay, I think we can stop there, and you all did great. The correct answer was, in fact, D, all of the above, as we said, especially with these soft drinks, like Powerades and that sort of stuff. The color is really important. In fact, you can get a cherry flavored, Kool-Aid to taste orange if you put orange food coloring into it, and vice versa. The intensity is also very important, and that's something I think that the Powerades really make use of. That the brighter the red, the more intense the orange, the stronger the flavor. Even though the actual flavorful chemicals in the drink, whatever those are, don't change. The color can change how strong it tastes in terms of its flavor. Visible texture, we talked about that in terms of custards. Remember that kind of cool little magic custard bowl where you're sipping custard that's different from the one you're actually looking at. The thickness of the custard, its texture, is going to have a bearing on how sweet you say that the custard is, because sweetness is affected by thickness and that sort of thing. So all three are correct. The correct answer is all of the above. Good. There's one question. Looks like there's a couple of questions on chat again. Nice. Let's see. Good. My sister once made a plain vanilla cake with red pink frosting, and I ate it and it tasted like strawberries. Exactly what we're talking about. Yep. Later, she told me it was vanilla and the taste changed. Yeah, that's very interesting. My own experience with this actually has to do with something I've been drinking. I have a little glass of water here so my mouth doesn't get too dry while I'm teaching. These are actually sodas. Well, not soda, it's that Soda Stream thing, and I actually put sugarless flavor in it, and they're all clear. And so, the flavors are a little bit more diluted than they would normally be. And sometimes I do have some trouble identifying the flavor because they all look the same. So yeah, I was very aware of that when I started using these things. So yeah, it's funny. Great. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Any other questions before we change topics? Again, this is where we are going into the material that's going to be tested on the final exam, not the test that's this weekend. Let's go ahead and do that. We are going to start talking about touch by meeting a really interesting guy. I think you'll really enjoy learning about him. Okay, his name is, here, I can put this up. His name is John Bramblett. There he is right there. And John is blind, as you can see, and he lost his sight later, though, in life. He lost his sight, I think, started losing his sight when he was 17 or 18, and then was pretty much completely blind by the age of 20. And he had a kind of interesting reaction to it, kind of emotionally. Of course, it's a very scary and potentially sad thing to lose your sight at that age. So one of the ways he dealt with it was to take a painting of all things, right? You can imagine taking up a musical instrument or something like that because your hearing is still good, but he decided to take a painting. Now, he had a little experience with painting when he was a kid, in art classes and stuff like that. And importantly, I guess we should say, his mother paints as a serious hobbyist. She spends a lot of time painting, so he was kind of introduced to it in his home. But he never really painted. He was more of a musician in terms of hobbies. But he decided to take painting up and take it up seriously when he was in his 20s. How does he do it? He does it through touch. He does it through touching the canvas, touching paint, and touching his subjects, depending on what he's painting, you know, feeling faces, that sort of thing. But touching the canvas, how does that work? Well, I'm going to show you a little video first, and then we'll introduce this technique, and then we'll talk about it in some detail.
My sight went very slowly at first. I didn't even realize it when I first noticed I was having trouble with my sight. I was already really twice over the legal limit for being blind. There were just less and less things I could do. I couldn't go out as much, or if I did, I needed assistance. There were just so many things I couldn't do. I just had a lot of anger building up. And I didn't even realize I was that angry, but I started painting. I don't know, so much as an outlet or a way of defiance in a way. You know, it's something that is viewed as very visual. After a while, I started becoming less and less angry. The more I painted, the more, you know, I could let that out, and to where now it just, you know, I have to paint. You know, starting painting was sort of a crazy thing in a way. I mean, but I decided I just was going to do it. I couldn't write. You know, I didn't have a computer at the time that could read to me. I feel like if I didn't have some sort of creative outlet, I was going to go crazy. I just needed to put something out there. In a way, it was out of anger. I mean, it was a way of, I don't know, like giving the middle finger to the universe or God or whatever you want to call it. You know, saying, well, I may not be visual, but I'm still going to do this. I'm still going to try. And I really didn't care what it looked like. I didn't care if it was visually appealing. I just wanted to do it. I thought the physical action of painting, of putting what's in my mind out there, actually in the physical world, even if no one else liked it, I wanted to create something like that. That's really what got me into it. And I went and got some oil paints and just started. I told my mom that I started painting, and she was like, "Oh, that's great." She was so worried when her and my dad came over one day, and she wanted to be so supportive. You know, she didn't want to let me down, but she was so relieved when she looked at it. She liked it, and she actually liked it. The reason I lost my vision is I have a seizure disorder. I've had it ever since I was a kid. The seizure will start in the front, and it'll hit the back where the occipital lobe is, because you actually see back here the optic nerve travels from your eyes around to the very back. So that my eyes work, I get light in, but the brain, the part that deciphers the image, doesn't know what to make with it. So it's sort of like a TV that you have on, but there's no signal, there's no antenna or cable or anything attached. So it's just like it's just snow. It's just from the seizures, which is rare, it turns out. So, but if you have enough of them, you know, it'll do it. The main problem when doing a painting, if you can't see it visually, is keeping oriented on the canvas and knowing exactly where you are and what you've done. I've always drawn using pencils or pens, but you can't feel pencils or pen strokes once you've put them down. And so I started using Elmer's glue because it dries and it's hard, but Elmer's glue takes about a day to dry. So whenever you make one line, you've got to wait about a day to go back and fill it again. So then I started using whiteout, the whiteout pen, and that makes a very nice line that you can fill. But if you paint it on canvas, over time it seeps into the canvas, so your drawing will disappear. And now I used this stuff called slick paint, and it dries really, really fast. It doesn't disappear, it stays there, and you can fill it. And it orients you to the painting, and that's really all you need. That's all a person's eyes do whenever they're painting. Probably the next hardest thing was colors, but with oil paint, the great thing about oil paints is that they're all made with different substances, and it gives them a different viscosity and a different texture. The white, it almost feels like caulk or toothpaste. It's very thick, very viscous. And black is almost runny. It still has a thickness to it, but compared to white, it's almost like oil. If you were to mix half white and half black, the feeling and the viscosity is somewhere halfway in between. So you can just start working from there. Sometimes I'll decide on a color just because I like the way it feels. When I first started, I painted very slowly. I would make a small sketch and it would take me 8 hours to make one little sketch. I've sped up quite a bit. And part of it is just I can remember a lot more. Like whenever my hand goes over the drawing, I can feel the lines, and then I remember where they are, and then my other, over time I've learned to follow it a little bit more exact. One hand sort of to see the canvas, and the other hand to fill in the paint. It's hard to tell sometimes when you have a lot going on in painting if it's actually working or if the colors are very good. It's nice to have an artist to go talk to, someone that you can talk to that you can say, is this actually the color that I was going for? And them to be able to say yes or it is or not. Does it work? Is this composition? Can you see what I'm kind of getting at here? And so the input's just invaluable.
Way it kind of like gives it like a circular, like the tracks direct the eye, and then it goes down like that. So you've already, I mean, I wouldn't move it. That's just me.
Yeah, you're probably excited the cloud's going off on the left. If you're sighted, then you learn to paint just the way everybody that's sighted learns anything, by looking. But if you're not, then you learn it the way you learn everything else, just by touch and using your other senses. And it's not that different. It's just the image that's in your mind. You're just laying it down. It's just done in a different way, but it's the same. It's the same images, and it's the same outlet. And my ability to remember all the colors and shapes and where they go here, it helps my everyday, just getting around every day. Like I know, where this is, I mean, and that may sound simple, but I don't have to feel around for it as much. I mean, I'm able to keep so much more in my mind, so much more in my mental map of what's around me. A lot of people, when they lose their vision, you stop going out as much. You want to stay inside. It's safe. You know where everything is. You know where the furniture is. It's very safe. It's very easy. But going out, there's all these sounds, and even though I've been sighted all my life, it just seems like the world recedes in and becomes very small. Your world becomes what you can feel and touch. In my case, art has a very physical presence. It's actually made very real changes in my life. I mean, I'm able to get around better. I'm able to do things more, and it's all from painting. all for making, you know, two-dimensional paintings really helps me in this three-dimensional world. It makes everything so much richer. If I touch a person's skin, it may feel like red, and I know a person isn't colored red, but in my mind they are. And I stopped thinking to myself that that's wrong.
Okay, terrific. That gives you a general sense of how he's able to paint. But let's talk about some of this detail. Of course, what I'm most interested in telling you about is how his sense of touch allows him to do this. So let's go ahead and discuss some of those things. You're seeing all paintings by him. So he does, some paintings from memory. This is his church when he was growing up. And then some paintings from touch. This is his doggy. This is a friend that he, touch the faces and then render them first on maybe a small piece of paper using this paint that kind of creates a kind of raised line. And then, by doing it first on paper, he'll then transfer it to a large canvas, also using that paint that creates a large line. Looks like, I guess he lost his sight. He was officially completely blind when he was 25. And as I said, he had little painting experience. As you heard him there, he decided to take it up kind of as a, way to kind of, deal with his anger and frustration and all that, which is really interesting. The technique he uses, though, is, I think, really, really interesting for this particular topic of touch and how the brain changes from experience with touch. So let's go through his technique a little bit. He uses this type of paint now called puffy paint, which I guess is often used like on textiles, like, I guess people sometimes use it when they're young and to make designs on jackets and t-shirts and stuff like that. And if you've used it before, it does leave a raised line from where you outline your objects that you're creating on the jacket or whatever, and it dries very quickly. And it is enough of a raised line that he can then follow the lines, the outlines of his subject, whether it's a dog face or a church, with his left hand, and then fill in color with the paintbrush in his right hand. This is a technique you saw him do there. And actually, I should mention, this is a fairly old video. I think that video is from 2010 or so. You're going to see his technique has actually changed a little bit, but this is what you just saw. So he's following the raised line with his left hand. You saw him touching it with his fingers and then painting in between. He fills in the spaces with paint. Now, he mentioned there that he uses oil paint. And if any of you have any experience painting, you know that oil paint ain't great. It ain't easy to use. It is messier. It takes longer to dry. I think it's more expensive than acrylic, which is more often used these days. But there's a really important reason why he continues to use oil paints. And that is because the way oil paints are produced, they end up with very different consistencies depending on the color, which make them distinct in terms of how they feel in his fingers. So I'll just put this term out. It's tactily. That means tactile means touch. They are distinct in terms of how they feel. They're tactily distinct. And this turns out to be a really important characteristic for him. As he said, the white feels pasty, kind of like toothpaste. The black feels like very thin, like it's oil or something like that. And so what he'll do in order to, know, well, first he will lay the paints out in front of him in an order that he'll remember. But say he wants to, make sure that he's using the white or make sure that he's using the black, he will touch it and make sure, yeah, this is the thick one, this is the white. Beyond that, though, if he wants to, say, create a gray by mixing together black and white, say, okay, this is the white and this is pretty thick, this is the black and this is pretty thin. If I then mix them together on the palette here, then I'll know I have a gray if it's something between, if it feels like it's between the thickness of the white and the thinness of the black. So it allows him to mix paints. And this isn't just for black and white. This is for every other color he could possibly want to use. He mixes paints by feeling what the resulting texture is like, based on the fact that the oils are, going to feel very, very different. And I guess according to him, it's not just like, feeling the thickness of the oil paint or the thinness, with the black and white. There's other types of consistencies, like almost a little gritty, maybe a color, or, maybe it feels kind of soft, not really a thick or thin, but kind of soft in his fingers. And he'll, be able to mix paint based on knowing what the kind of, the in-between feel would be like of adding these paints together. As I said, he feels the lines with his non-brushed hand. Historically, that's how you saw him do it. Now, actually, when I interviewed him, so that video must be from before 2010, because when I interviewed him, he said that he had learned to not need his left hand nearly as much. And he preferred this because it was much less messy. So yeah, he would sometimes, to kind of confirm where the lines were, he would use his left hand, but, or to mix the paint, he would, feel the consistency in between. But now his brush hand, his right hand, is so sensitive that he really doesn't need to touch the paint or the canvas directly with his left hand. So let's first talk about mixing paint, where he used to have to, as you saw him do there, feel the actual oils to see if it was something in between what he was after. After the white and black to, get the gray. He can now, not without touching it with his left hand, actually use the brush and feel the brush's resistance as he kind of pulls the brush through the paint to know if it's something between the thickness of the white and the thinness of the black. Okay, so, actually I have a brush here. Yeah, here it is. Yeah, so he's mixing this on his palette here, and he's able to tell by the resistance of the brush against the mixed paint, what type of paint, what kind of color he's using, by knowing it is something between those two slick and thick sorts of experiences. So that is something he has learned to do now. And he says he touches paint much less often. So it's the resistance to the brush. And that's also how, by the way, he's able to avoid touching the canvas as much with the left hand. So, these little raised lines are tiny. I know they're coming up maybe, maybe 1/8 of an inch at the very most. But now he can use the brush to kind of feel where they are. So his brush hand has become more sensitive to touch. Now, this is a different type of touch, right? Originally he's touching things directly, whether it's the mixing paint or the raised lines on the canvas. This is a touch now that occurs through the brush, but the sense of touch on the right hand as the lines of the canvas are kind of resisting the brush's motion are something that he can pick up now. And so we can also, as I said, he's able to determine the raised lines with the brush as well. And this is a type of touch we're going to talk about next week, that involves touch through using tools, because we're really, really good at that, as it turns out, using tools to touch things, for purposes of not having to get our hands messy and feeling things that are further away than our arms can reach and stuff like that. We'll get back into this next week. It's called proxy touch. In other words, touching things with tools is proxy touch. But this is something that he's kind of improved with his kind of touch experience over time. And that's the thing we're going to be most interested in here, how his sense of touch has improved so much with his experience. Let's take our little break here and we'll come back and continue to talk about John and then talk about some of the science behind what's going on with John's brain as he is in fact becoming a better painter. Okay, so I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, we are back. Let's do a practice question. Does that sound like a good idea? Yeah, let's do that. It'll be fun. Here comes your practice question. This one also has to do with taste. Oh, this one has to do with what's called, well, you'll see. It should be a pretty straightforward one. Why does hard candy taste sweet whenever it is located in wherever, oh, sorry. Gardener time again. My gosh, it's so loud. Why does a hard, probably can hear this. Okay. Why does a hard candy taste sweet whenever it is located in your mouth? Wherever it is located in your mouth. A, you have sweet taste buds all over your mouth. B, your taste buds move around to follow the candy. C, tactile capture makes it seem like the sweet flavor is located wherever the candy touches your mouth. Or D, none of the above. And let's go ahead and give you a chance to answer. Okay, you guys did well. I will share the results. Hey, you know, I realized something. You folks can probably see this title up here too while you're doing the questions. So I got to be careful that the title doesn't give away the answer. I just realized this. It's all practice questions anyway. It doesn't mean anything, but you probably found it easier because if I call this tactile capture of taste, then the answer is probably something to do with tactile capture. So why does a hard candy taste sweet wherever it's located in your mouth? Well, you do not have sweet taste buds all over your tongue, all over your mouth. You just have them pretty much in the front of your tongue. And that's really kind of the interesting phenomenon. It still tastes like it's sweet even when it's in the back of your tongue. Your taste buds do not move around. They're part of your, kind of rigid physiology. The answer is tactile capture, this really interesting phenomenon where once the item in your mouth is established as something that's sweet, wherever it touches your tongue, the flavor follows it around. And that's what tactile capture is all about. So the correct answer is definitely C here. No one chose D, none of the above. The correct answer is tactile capture. And you might have known that from the title. All right, I will stop sharing here. Continues to be very noisy where I am. I don't know if you can hear this. All right. Any questions on anything regarding either John Bramblett or anything concerning the test or any other information? Or should we continue talking about John? You can hear that, can't you? Okay, let's do that. Let's go back and talk about John. Not as loud where you are. Good. Glad to hear it. It is so loud here. There we go. By the way, if you're interested, I recommend that you go to John Bramblett's site. I think it's It's just johnbramblett.com or something like that. And you can look at his original artwork. You can, so just in case, you can, buy prints of his artwork, that sort of thing, get kind of the whole story. Yeah, you'll see he's quite accomplished, and he does make a living now doing this. He does paint from both memory, as I said, like that church, and for models. He does touch his models, the face, and if he does doing still lifes or something like that, like fruit on a table or a chair or something like that, he will touch those things as well. And what he argues is that, in some ways, touching something might give more kind of apprehension of detail. What he means by this is that he can actually, if you wanted to know, get some of the details of what a chair might look like, yes, you can look at it, but touching it might, tell you something about the screws that you hadn't really thought about including in the painting before, maybe some detail of how the different parts of the chair are connected to each other, that type of thing. He says that touching actually gives a really interesting perspective on what can be portrayed in a painting. It's interesting. Other things he said about this is that some of his colors seem very kind of almost psychedelic. They seem they're intentionally not supposed to represent reality, and I mean he's very aware of that. And he says, well, really, what's important to me is that the kind of the touch is being consistent. So he might touch his dog's skin or a person's skin and say, boy, that reminds me of how the oil paint blue feels. Their skin feels blue to me, so I'll render it as blue. And of course, he knows that people don't have blue skin, but he thinks it to be an interesting way to kind of translate his touch experience to the painting. And we'll tell people when they see the painting, this is why he chose that color, because the model felt like blue, which is like what the paint felt like, right? It's kind of interesting. So let's continue. These are these two top pictures are his. These are other paintings of his. John also not only makes money from his paint, he actually teaches. John teaches painting to both the blind and sighted. So he's been teaching at schools for the blind and teaching blind children to paint. And sometimes he teaches their families to paint too if they're interested, that sort of thing. But he's also taught painting. He's been brought in to teach painting to sighted art students, and this is kind of interesting. He says he always starts, when he starts teaching sighted students, he does the same thing. What he'll do is he'll put an apple in the middle of the room and ask the students to paint it, and they will all paint what is looking pretty much like an apple. It's a simple thing to do, and they can do it very quickly. He said, okay, great. Now what I want to do is take the apple and have each of you hold and touch the apple with your eyes closed. And they'll do that one at a time. He said, now I want you to paint the apple. And what they'll do is they will paint more detail. They'll paint with different perspectives. So each person's painting now won't just look like the same apple. There'll be more detail, and there'll be kind of more subjective, kind of detail too, that different people, when they touch things, feel different parts of it, or maybe feel like that some parts of it are more, kind of prominent than others. And he says, this is kind of an interesting argument for paintings being more than just a visual medium. The artist might really benefit from closing their eyes and touching their subjects sometimes in order to get ideas on how to render an image visually then, which is really interesting. The other end of that is also true. So he, given his notoriety now, has been invited to touch paintings of famous people. And, typically what this involves is some art collector, some wealthy art collector will find out about John and say, hey, listen, next time you're in town, if you'd like to come over, I'd be happy to let you touch some of my, my collection. Let me just check the chat to make sure everything's working well. Okay, good, not too bad. So he has been able to go to people's homes and touch the paintings of artists such as Cezanne and Rembrandt, this one here, and Van Gogh, this one over here. And he says that by touching the painting and actually also having it described to him, he feels like he almost gets a more intimate connection to the artist than one would by looking at the painting. Okay, clearly this can't be, this is something that you don't want to have done very much to a precious painting like this. Your fingers can leave oil and that sort of thing on it. So it's not something he can do in a museum, but he can, if someone invites him to do it, he will do it and clean his hands, I'm sure, very well beforehand. But he says that he can feel, not just some of the, objects in the painting, based on the types of paints that are used, but he can feel the brushstrokes. And that's a really interesting idea, that he knows that there are certain artists that use kind of more aggressive brushstrokes than others. Like, look at this Van Gogh here. You can see that, these are very kind of aggressive brushstrokes, right? Maybe it's a little bit more smooth up here, but other artists will, use more kind of more languid, kind of more smooth brushstrokes than others, and how they'll kind of bunch up the paint in one part of the canvas is something that he can touch with his hands. And he says that it kind of gives him an intimate experience of what the painting act might have been like for the artist, right? So maybe Van Gogh, when he was doing this down here, was being aggressive for some emotional reason at the time. He feels like he can kind of almost get into the artist's head more by touching the painting rather than seeing it, which is a really interesting idea. And I think by the end of my discussion with him, he made a very interesting argument about visual art maybe being more than visual, right? And I think that we have a sense of this maybe with sculptures. We aren't able to touch sculptures in museums, of course. We get kicked out of the museum if we do that. But there's been times where we wanted to, certainly want to see what that feels like. That's probably even true with painting to some degree. Certainly the artist can benefit from touching the model that he's painting, he or she is painting. And maybe even being able to touch the painting after it's done provides a certain type of perspective on what the artist was intending that just looking at the painting would not. I just think it's such a fascinating sort of idea that he conveyed. And he teaches this. He teaches this to both sighted and blind students. Terrific. Okay, any questions? Looks like there's a chat question. I wonder if he could feel fake art. You're asking a really interesting question, Ivy, because this is something that folks that look for forgeries will do. They will look at the brushstroke with a microscope, okay? And they have a sense, and this is really interesting, they have a sense by looking at the brushstroke whether this is the type of painting, the type of action Van Gogh would be using if it were truly a Van Gogh. It is something they do. Now, whether he could feel a forgery, I'm not sure. But this idea that by kind of zeroing in on the type of brushstroke as a way to determine whether the artist truly did this or whether it was a forgery is something that is done by sighted folks and sighted folks using microscopes and that sort of thing. It's an interesting idea. I'd be surprised if that's a good question whether he'd be able to tell if something was a real Van Gogh or a fake Van Gogh, depending on. He might be able to. That's a good question. Interesting idea. All right, thank you. All right, there any other questions about John? I mean, go to his website. I think you'll find it really, really interesting. He's really gotten quite good at painting. You can see the development of his technique, and it's really very impressive. Really nice guy too. I think he's got a number of videos posted where he's doing interviews and things like that. You get a real sense, get a sense of the type of person he is. Very, very, very kind. Okay, great. Let's get into some of the science then. And we'll start off by talking about blindness and touch and what happens with folks that are blind. And this is our first time really. Now we talked a little bit about this in the context of echolocation when we were talking about Daniel Kish, but more has been studied with regard to the compensation of the blind with regard to touch than with regard to hearing. So this is one of our kind of themes that we'll be looking at throughout the rest of the quarter, which has to do with cross-sensory compensation for sensory loss. We've talked about a little bit about it, but we're going to be talking about it a lot more now. And as I'm saying, this is one of the first instances that has been studied, with a lot, basically. And research on the blind and their enhanced skills with touch has been studied since probably the 80s, and it continues to be studied. Initially, a lot of this research was done with people that were born blind or became blind at a very early age. And it was thought initially that the compensation doesn't really occur with folks that lose their sight at a later age. This is a long time ago. This is the 80s, 90s. And a lot of that had to do with some assumptions about the brain not being able to change very much after our infancy and toddlerhood, I would say. But the brain didn't change that much, and it wouldn't change that much in folks that lost their vision later in life. But little by little, over the last few decades, we've learned that, oh yeah, the brain does continue to change, and it changes a lot, and it will continue to change and show cross-sensory compensation even for individuals who go blind later in life, like John Bramlett's a nice example. He's lost his sight at 25. And even later than that, for that matter. That sort of cross-sensory compensation occurs even later than that. But let's talk first about folks that lose their vision very early in life. It's been known for a while that they do have greater touch sensitivity. There's lots of ways of testing touch sensitivity. You can use something like a paintbrush and have it on a device that kind of slowly goes down. And the question is, at what point can they feel those tiny little soft bristles of the brush are touching the skin? And it's been known that the blind are able to detect something touching their skin sooner than folks that are sighted. In fact, that difference can be pretty dramatic. That difference can, offset aging. So as you get older, your sense of touch does get a little less sensitive. That's absolutely true. And you might know that, one of the reasons it's thought that older people have more falls, and, falling, like just falling over while walking down the street, can be very dangerous when you're in your, 70s and 80s and that sort of thing. One of the reasons they are more likely to fall is because they don't have as much sensitivity on the bottom of their feet as they used to. So they do have a little more trouble balancing as they're walking, because they don't feel the kind of pressure on the soles of their feet as well as younger people do. Okay, so yes, we do lose our sense of touch, our sensitivity to touch a little bit as we get older. By the time you're 80, you lose it. You lose it pretty noticeably. However, if somebody is blind, they don't lose it nearly as much. Okay, so they have greater touch sensitivity, and that touch sensitivity will keep them, they'll keep their sensitivity as if they are 25 years younger. So what's said to occur here is that, say, somebody, so when you're 50, your sense of touch is still pretty good. But when you're 75, it's not as good as it was, that's for sure. However, for blind individuals, they will maintain their touch sensitivity when they're 75 as if they were still 50, right? So there is that kind of advantage of touch for individuals who've lost their sight. Why? And again, this is often tested, with fingertips, various instruments. Or do I have anything else here? Yeah, okay, we can do it this way. Ooh. So let's see. I just have a little plug here. But imagine what you could do is that this would be a device where, these little two prongs would be close together or further apart, and say they start off together. So it's not, pretend it's not a plug, it's a little device that a physical therapist might use, where the prongs are completely next to each other, and your eyes are closed, and it goes on your skin. And the question is, does it feel like one prong or two prong? And at first it's going to feel like one prong because they're right next to each other. But then slowly she's able to move them out apart from each other and touch the skin. And the question is, how far do they need to be apart from each other for one to feel two prongs versus one prong? And it is true for the blind, they are able to feel two prongs sooner than somebody who's not blind. Okay, that's another way that it's demonstrated that the blind do have better touch sensitivity. So why? Why do they have better touch sensitivity? Well, one intuition, at least initially, was Braille. Okay, so you know what Braille is, probably, right? When I teach this in school, in a lecture hall, I can go right up to one of the signs in the lecture hall and show you that there's Braille there. There's Braille on every sign on campus, like all the room number signs and all that sort of stuff. That underneath there is a Braille rendering of it. And what Braille is are these like little raised dot patterns, right? You can see this right here. And you've seen them around campus, or you've seen them in other contexts as well, probably. So is that why the blind are better? Are the blind better? Are they more sensitive with touch because they have experience with Braille? And even though it's a good intuition, it's probably not true. Why? Because very, very few blind individuals actually use Braille. And that's something I didn't know until I was doing research for the book. I thought, well, probably at least half of blind individuals have learned Braille along the way, right? But it's actually, when I wrote the book, it was 10%, and it might even be less now. So back in the older days, before it was so easy to get your computer to read you books, or to, there were, audiobooks and podcasts and all that sort of stuff. The only way a blind individual could read a book, there were some audiobooks back then, but very few. They would have to learn Braille, but that's no longer the case. But even back in 2010, only 10% were using it. Now it is the case. So you're wondering, why do they put it around a college campus? It is the case that individuals who are enrolled in college likely do still use Braille, so they might make use of what's on the signs around campus. But overall, very few individuals, blind individuals, learn to read Braille these days. Very, very few. Again, partly because of the technological advances in just getting, your computer, Siri or whatever, to read text. Okay, so they don't necessarily need it. And in fact, when they were doing that research, they asked people, who showed this kind of enhanced sensitivity to touch if they read Braille, and most of them said no. Most of them said no. So that's not it. What's going on here has to be something other than just touch experience, it would seem. Maybe touch experience has a little to do with it, but it's something else. And this is the idea of cross-modal plasticity. Cross-modal, cross-sensory, this is the same idea. Is that in the early blind, and probably in the later blind too, I think there's evidence for this, that the other senses do get heightened a little bit, and do so by making use of the areas of the brain that are not being used by the lost sense. Okay. So what I'm saying here is, when one loses their sight and have very little visual input, they are using the visual areas of their brain to dedicate to the other senses to some degree. Okay, we did talk a little bit about this when we talked about Daniel Kish and echolocation, right? We're going to talk about it in a lot of detail now. So it is dedicated to touch as well if one loses their sight. So let's just kind of talk about some of the examples of this. When we touch something, those of us that are sighted, I should say, when a sighted person touches something, or actually this is true of the blind too, everyone has a region of their brain It's called the somatosensory cortex. Don't worry about the technical details, but we'll call it the touch brain region. It's kind of this little strip right here that lights up. And actually the parts of the body are actually mapped onto different areas along this little strip of the brain. Okay. And that's true of everybody when we touch something, blind or sighted. However, in addition, when a blind individual touches something, they also activate an area that is typically used for vision in sighted people. So this part back here. Now, it happens more for some types of touching than other types of touching, but it does happen, okay? And it happens pretty systematically with blind individuals. So it's as if, you know, a blind individual no longer has input there, and that region of the brain is saying, hey, can I help out with the other senses? Touch, do you need help? Hearing, can I help you too? And they'll say, yeah, that'd be great, especially since we, you know, aren't able to access light anymore. It'd be nice if you could help out a little bit here. Thank you. And so that part of the brain says, okay, I'll make touch more sensitive. I'll make hearing a little bit more sensitive, but it does so in very, very interesting ways. Okay, so let me give you some examples. Some ways that this kind of cross-sensory plasticity, cross-modal plasticity, modal and sensory here are the same thing. We talk about modes of the senses, same thing. How this sort of thing was initially discovered. So what happened was this is long before brain imaging or other sorts of techniques. This is just somebody we used to know a lot of. We used to understand what was going on in the brain as much as it would let us through brain lesions. People would have some sort of stroke, and we knew there was damage in the brain, and we'd be able to infer what areas of the brain were involved based on where the stroke was and what sort of functions were inhibited by the stroke. So this was an individual who knew Braille, and she had a stroke in her visual area, and she was able to recognize things through touch to some degree, but what she lost pretty much completely was her ability to use Braille. So this is a woman, she's blind from birth, a long time ago, 70s or 80s. She was blind from birth. She was older, she had a stroke. They knew the stroke was in the visual areas of the brain. After she recovers from the stroke and is able to communicate and be tested and that sort of thing, she was able to recognize things generally by feel, like this type of thing, a glass, whatever. But when it came to Braille, she was no longer able to do it. Okay, so the idea here is that when it comes to maybe extra sensitive touch, when it comes to precision touch, when it comes to using touch to be able to recognize patterns, very kind of subtle patterns, the visual brain, her visual brain areas were helping. And that after she had the stroke, she was no longer able to do that. Much of the rest of her touch sense was okay. She was as good as everybody else when it came to, touching, recognizing paintbrushes, that sort of stuff. Oh, yeah. Okay. My computer froze. I'm okay. Recognizing paintbrushes and stuff like that. But when it came to Braille, she was unable to do it. Okay. Those were the old days. Nowadays, fortunately, we don't have to wait for somebody to have a stroke to study this. We can use brain imaging, but we can also use another technique that's going to become one of your best friends for the rest of the quarter. A technique that allows us to essentially create a very short-term and very kind of light, very temporary stroke in the brain. And this is a technique that's been terrifically useful for us to understand the brain, for us to understand the senses, for us to understand the higher processing of the brain, called transcranial magnetic stimulation. As I said, it's going to become one of your friends. So, remember the term. We're going to abbreviate it TMS. And essentially what it does is it's a technique that induces a transient lesion. It very temporarily, a matter of seconds, maybe minutes, will basically disrupt a specific brain area. And it can be done with normal, healthy subjects. Okay? This is what you're seeing. You're seeing that right down here, by the way. This is how it looks. And it's basically like these little, what is it, a key looking or a mouse ears or something, like Mickey Mouse ears. And it's basically this thing that can kind of hover around a person's head. It is then put next to specific regions of the brain outside, right? And there's basically a strong magnetic pulse that is then created from this device that affects the brain, and where it is pointed will determine what the function of that area might be, because it will stop working or stop working well for some period of time. Now, don't worry, it's not pervasive. It's not something that's going to have long-term effects if it's just done, shortly in these experiments. You come right back and your brain's fine after that. Also, it doesn't, completely wipe out a sense or something like that. It kind of more does a suppression of the sense, if that's what you're after. It is, in fact, a technique that is used for therapeutic purposes, by the way, too. I know it's been used to treat depression. I know it's been used to treat tinnitus, so that's ringing in your ears. I know that they've used it to try to treat that. I don't know what the success, but I think there is some. It's been used to treat phantom pain, which we'll be talking about soon. So it does have these terrific therapeutic uses, as well as these scientific uses that help us understand where, what's going on in different regions of the brain. So we don't have to wait for people to have strokes. We don't have to only test people to have strokes. We can actually induce a mini stroke very temporarily, very safely, to understand what regions of the brain are involved in what type of functions. And that's glorious. So let's do this now with both blind and sighted subjects. The first thing we'll do is we will, swing it around to the side. So right now you're seeing the device kind of pointed towards the visual area, but let's first, before we do that, swing it to the side and kind of orient it in a way that's just going to affect this little strip right here. It's just going to affect this little strip. And what that's going to do, if we then turn it on, is it will affect a person's ability. If we're affecting the touch brain region on the side, it will affect a person's ability to discriminate shapes, subtle shapes, from something in their hand. So they're not using vision here. Everyone's blindfolded in these experiments, and they're asked, okay, I'm putting something in your hand. Can you tell me what it is? They'll say, I don't know, I'm not sure. Maybe it's a triangle shape or something like that. In that case, it was a square, and then like a little sphere about the same size is put in, and people lose their ability to discriminate shapes like that. I mean, the shapes might be maybe more subtly different than that. Maybe it's not a sphere versus a square or something like that. Maybe it's a perfectly round sphere versus one that's a little more egg-shaped. It's that type of discrimination, but it is going to affect it, okay, by kind of turning that piece a little bit off of the brain right there, okay? But now what we can do is swing it around back to the back of the head again, and we can see whether that's going to affect the touch sensitivity or the touch skills of both blind and sighted individuals. And what you find is when you swing it around to the back of the sighted individual and turn it on, it does affect their vision a little bit, but it does not affect their sense of touch very much at all. If, on the other hand, you swing it around to the back of the head of a blind person and turn it on, it does affect their sense of touch, and it affects it in such a way that they are still able now to discriminate like an egg shape from a sphere shape. They can do that again. It's no longer being kind of affecting the sensory strip. What they have trouble doing is kind of discriminating fine touch pattern discrimination. Okay, so here's where they start having trouble. If they're Braille users, they're going to have trouble with Braille. Even if they're not Braille users, if they're given kind of little dots to distinguish through touch, they can do it before the transcranial magnetic stimulation is affecting their visual brain. But once it's turned on, they can't do it well. So it's a really nice, straightforward way of showing that, yeah, for blind individuals, okay, their visual brain is involved in touch, and it seems like it's involved in touch in such a way that it's affecting their fine discrimination abilities, their fine touch discrimination abilities. It's not affecting, you know, object recognition through holding something in their hand. They can still do that. But when it comes to feeling the number of bumps that they're feeling or something like that, yeah, it's affecting it. So now this is nice. We just kind of confirmed that finding that took a stroke patient to show us. Now we can actually, you know, do it in the laboratory with, you know, blind subjects, with normal subjects, and induce the stroke for a very short period of time and learn a lot about the brain this way. Okay, it's a very, very useful technique. Really, really useful technique. Okay, we're going to continue talking about this, but I think, let's see, where do we start? Let's see, hold on, this might be a good place. Nah, let's wait. Let me go through this next slide. It's a little complicated, but I'll go through this next slide, then I'll do a practice question. Okay. We're going to actually spend the next slide talking about a single experiment with many different conditions. Okay, and I actually alluded to this last class a little bit when we were talking about taste. This is the experiment where sighted individuals, we're dealing with sighted individuals now, are going to be deprived of vision for a number of days. Right. So in this experiment, they basically checked into a hospital room. It was a research hospital, so this was part of the research section of the hospital. They would check into a room and be blindfolded for the 5-day period. And you can see it's a pretty serious blindfold, by the way. Their gauze is put over their eyes. They then get an ace bandage over that. And I think sometimes they actually put another blindfold on top of that. So it is a serious blindfold, not the type you can peek through the side like when you were a little kid playing, Pin the Tail of the Donkey or, whatever the other games are that you're blindfolded for. Anyway, 5 days of visual deprivation. 5 days. So, these folks are paid pretty well. And the question is, using both, as you'll see, the transcranial magnetic stimulation device, and by looking at the brain's changes through magnetic resonance imaging, functional magnetic resonance imaging, what happens when you are deprived of vision for that many days, okay? So the first thing you do is, I guess probably they get a baseline brain image of you. You come in and they look at your brain as you're sighted, just to get a kind of sense of what the different brain regions are doing, while you're sighted. And then they blindfold you and get another baseline. And so you'll go back into the scanner now that you've been blindfolded for a few minutes, and they'll get another one just to kind of get baselines to see what's going to happen. Okay, and again, these are just functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. It's a really nice way of looking at details of brain activity. Cool. All right, go back. Thank you for the pictures. Now go back to your hospital room, and there'll be someone there to hang out with you. You can chat with them. You can have some fun. It's time for lunch. Have your lunch, and then we'll start talking about the next step. And guess what happens when you have your lunch? We can talk about this a little bit more. In fact, one of the first things you notice is that food tastes more bland, just like we suggested before. And this wasn't part of the experiment. It really wasn't. And it was kind of like an anecdote that was just, a description that was in the kind of research, that they didn't really test this. They didn't, do experiments to see. At this point, they hadn't done experiments to see if people's taste discrimination skills were deprived at all. But all the subjects who had been blindfolded said the same thing, that lunch stunk, and everyone thought it was because it was hospital food, but it turns out it wasn't. It was nice food, but no one thought it tasted good at all. And so, yeah, this is kind of more evidence that being deprived of visual access to your food, like we saw in the dark restaurants, is actually going to suppress your ability to taste the food, which is interesting. And that's since been tested more directly and more systematically. Okay, that's kind of more of an anecdote about this experiment. But what we're going to do now that lunch is over is we're going to have you, since you have 5 days blindfolded and you're in a hospital room, we're going to have you do this. We're going to have you basically touch bumps. And it's going to be very much like Braille, but it's not exactly Braille. Okay, so it's basically raised dot discrimination. And the question is, imagine it does look like Braille characters, but rather than actually being related to the actual letters, they're a little bit simpler than that. It's not important, you know, the details, but the question is, can people touch well enough to discriminate whether it's 2 or 3 dots going, you know, vertically? Is it 2 or 3? You just do that with one of your fingers, right? You feel it, you do it with one of your fingers. Is that 2 or 3? And it's hard. It's very hard. And what they're going to do now is they're going to bring you back to the scanner and have you do it, and you know, see what happens as you're touching. Okay, I see my internet connection's a little unstable. I assume it's okay, but I will slow down here just a second. Okay. So that's it. You're going back to the scanner now and you're touching, and that's kind of a way of getting another baseline. Cool. Okay, thank you very much for that. We looked at your visual cortex, we looked at your touch cortex, your touch area, and we have a sense of what it's like when you're first trying to discriminate those dots, those little bumps, after you've been initially blindfolded. Cool. Okay. You can do fun things maybe that night. You can hang out with the other folks in the experiment a little bit. You have to stay blindfolded, but hey, this is, you know, this is part of the experiment. You're getting paid a lot of money for this. Okay. Next day you get up and you have to then start doing what the important part of the experiment is, which is to learn to basically, we're going to say it's Braille in this case. You're going to have Braille lessons for 6 hours a day. Okay, hopefully you're getting paid a lot of money. So we're going to stay blindfolded and we're going to teach you to discriminate Braille characters for 6 hours a day. All right. And as you do that, at the end of the 6 hours, for the last half hour of that 6 hours, we're going to bring you back in the scanner and have you try to discriminate those bumps as we look to see what your brain is doing. Okay. So they're going to continue to retest your brain reactions to your touch discrimination as the days go on, as the 5 days go on. Okay. All right. So we're going to take note. Is anything changing in the brain now? Because this is, you know, it's about brain changes. So yeah, it very well could be kind of a prediction that if people are blindfolded, they no longer have use of their visual cortex for seeing. Could it be that even over a short period like that, their visual brain gets rededicated to touch? Okay, that's what we're wondering here. Okay. Finally, so you go through this for 3 other days, and then on the last day, they have you do this again. But now what they do when it comes to your discrimination test on that day 5 test, they bring in that TMS device, you know, the little mouse ears, and they apply it to your visual area. They apply it back here. Okay, and the question is, if you were improving, and you can imagine you would absolutely improve with your Braille skills, your touch discrimination skills over those 5 days, can they basically kind of revert that skill by temporarily breaking your visual area? Very kind of clever thing to do at the very end. Okay. All right. There's your experiment. Now, let's see what the results say. First of all, okay, discrimination of touch, okay, as you're doing that, induces activity in the visual brain area, like we had predicted it might, over those 5 days. So in other words, even, you know, so your visual area is not getting any light input. It's not doing what it's normally doing. So even with 5 short days of visual deprivation, that area can help out touch. It gets rededicated to touch over the course of 5 days. All right. Now, that's cool. That's very cool. That makes sense. And what it suggests is that this idea that there's cross-modal, cross-sensory plasticity, cross-sensory changes can happen in a really short time. Remember, we said initially that everyone thought you had to be born blind to show these kind of changes. And then I said, well, it turns out, someone like John Bramblett's going to show that his visual cortex is also being rededicated to touch, right? It's allowing him to feel the paints and to feel the raised lines on the canvas. But it's not just that. It's even folks that aren't blind, that are just blindfolded for 5 days. Their visual cortex says, I'm not getting any input right now. Can I help anybody else out? And even across those 5 days, that becomes less of a visual area and more of a touch area. It's exactly what goes on, okay? Now, one thing I didn't mention to you is that there are other groups of subjects here as well. You got paid good bucks. But you might be a little frustrated to know that there was another group of subjects in the hallway next door, the other hallway over there, that was also blindfolded for 5 days. But they actually didn't go through, I'm sorry, they were not blindfolded. They just learned Braille. So you were blindfolded and learned Braille. They learned Braille as much as you did across 6 days, 5 days, sorry, across 5 days, 6 hours per day. Okay, their brains were scanned too, but they were not blindfolded. And the question is, even though they were learning Braille that much, did their visual cortex get rededicated to touch like yours did as a blindfolded person? And the answer is absolutely not. Very little of their visual cortex showed any responses to the Braille training at all. Okay, so again, kind of supporting what we saw on the previous slide, those brain changes occur by the visual deprivation, not just learning Braille, it seems, right? We suggested that maybe Braille was the reason that the blind had this touch sensitivity. Well, most of them don't know, most blind individuals don't know how to use Braille. It seems that the visual deprivation is important, right? In fact, not only is there another hallway of subjects over here that were not blindfolded and just learned Braille, there was a group of subjects in this other hallway that were the opposite. They were blindfolded for 5 days, but were never trained in Braille. They did, however, get scanned and had to try to discriminate those dots. And you would think, boy, I'm going to be a lot better at discriminating those dots than those folks over there are. And you might be a little bit better. But guess what? Just by virtue of being blindfolded, okay, and not learning Braille at all, they show the same thing, okay? So you were the unlucky group. You were both blindfolded and had to learn Braille. This group over here was not blindfolded and just learned Braille. This group over here did not learn Braille, but were blindfolded. You had to do both, right? These folks' visual brains were as involved in touch as yours was, okay? It induces activity in the group just by being blindfolded. They didn't need to be trained in Braille for that visual brain area, it's not getting vision anymore, to get rededicated. So what seems most critical here is the deprivation, is the fact that, light is not going to the visual centers. It's saying, hey, I need to do something here. Let me help touch out. And even if touch isn't involved in the training, there's no training involved in kind of helping the touch, right? It still does get rededicated to touch, okay? And in fact, for both groups, the group that's just blindfolded without the training, and your group, the group that is both blindfolded and trained, when that TMS comes in on the last day, okay, when the TMS, remember, is applied to the visual brain area, any sort of skills you developed in becoming a good toucher are in fact reduced. Okay, so it's clear your visual area is involved with touch and helps fine discrimination, even if you're not practicing fine discrimination. Okay, it is in fact the deprivation that allows that area to be rededicated, not necessarily the practice at all. Okay, so it's the visual deprivation will allow your visual brain to enhance your touch discrimination. And that happens just over a very short time, 5 days. You don't need to be born blind. You don't need to acquire blindness in your 20s or 30s or something like that. You can just be blindfolded. This is how kind of, powerful this kind of cross-sensory compensation, this kind of cross-modal plasticity, as we call it, is that it can even happen with short-term deprivation of a sense. And we'll see that it's even more dramatic than I'm portraying it just now. But this is probably a good time to take a little break for another polling question. Okay, so this will be our last polling question, I guess, today. Yes. One more on taste. Okay, which of the following is true of wine experts? A, they have better taste thresholds for wine. B, they have better taste discrimination for wine. C, they have enhanced activity in language and memory brain areas when sipping wine. Or D, none of the above. Okay, here we go. Go ahead and look back on your notes from our earlier discussion if you want. But you don't have to, because it doesn't mean nothing. Just remember the correct answer for your test. All right, another 10 seconds or so. All right, let's take a look at the answers. Yeah, most people got this right, but not everybody, so we will talk about it. The correct answer is D. I'm sorry, not D, C. The correct answer is they have enhanced activity in language and memory brain areas when sipping wine. I think everyone knew, it looked like, that we're not talking about thresholds. They have no better thresholds, meaning that if they, you had a glass of wine there and there was maybe one, I'm sorry, not a glass of wine, a glass of water, and there was one drop of wine in it, I wouldn't notice the wine, and neither would the expert. Maybe there has to be 3 drops of wine in it. At that point, I would notice it as a non-expert, and only then would the actual expert notice it too. So that's what we mean by a taste threshold. Okay, to know that you're tasting a wine in a glass of water. It's about the same for both the expert and the novice, such as me. But that is also true of the taste discrimination. What I mean by taste discrimination, I realize this can be a little confusing, is very, very subtle differences. We're talking about, kind of like very, kind of tongue differences. And what I mean by that is now it's an experiment where you have 2 glasses of the same wine. Starting off when you sip them, and I say, yeah, they taste the same. And then to make one wine taste a little different, you put some drops of a different wine into one of the glasses. And the question is the expert now going to be able to say, oh, yes, these now do taste like different wines sooner than the novice? And the answer is no. Okay, they taste the same to me, these 2 wines. Okay. Now the experimenter puts a couple of drops of another wine in there, a different wine, and we'll see. No, they still taste the same to me. And now maybe 3 or 4 more drops of that different wine. Yes, now I taste them. Now they are different wines. An expert would not be able to detect that difference any sooner than the novice. So that is not the correct answer. B is not the correct answer. C is the correct answer, because even though these kind of, these sensitivities for, either there being a wine present or a very subtle difference between the wine is not different between a novice and an expert. When an expert drinks, boy, does their brain do some amazing things. Okay, their language center kind of goes bang, 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 bang. Their memory centers get fired off. And that allows them, it would seem, then to, use kind of these kind of more, kind of high level sorts of skills to then be able to, categorize wines into, Cabernets and stuff like that, and to recognize wines and all that sort of stuff. So it is all that brain activity that is different from an expert to a novice, not just those little tiny thresholds. Okay, it's not like a tongue difference. It is a kind of higher brain difference that allows them to have the skills that they do. Okay, it seems a little confusing, I see, but anyone have any questions on this? Just remember, the correct answer on this one is C. You'll see the exact same question on your test tonight. So there you go. All right. Cool. Let me close this. All right. Any questions on any of that before we continue? We're going to go back to touch now. Again, this is stuff that's going to be on your final, not on the test this weekend. There we go. So hopefully you got an idea of what that experiment was like. Again, kind of the really kind of striking thing here is a couple of striking things, I would say. First of all, is how quickly this cross-sensory change occurs. This compensation occurs just after 5 days. That's the first thing. The second thing is what seems to kind of induce the compensation is not, practice with the Braille, right? Because that group down the hall that just was blindfolded and didn't practice had as much visual brain involvement in touch as our group did. It seems to be deprivation. It seems to be that a brain areas that are lost their job try to find another job right away so it can help the other senses. That's the other kind of take home from this. Okay, cool. I want to show you some even more dramatic examples of this. I'm going to talk about even shorter term deprivation having an effect. Okay, so not 5 days of blindfolding, 3 hours of blindfolding. So after having people blindfolded for 3 hours and basically doing nothing, maybe they're listening to a podcast or something like that, or having a chat with another subject who's going through the same thing, their visual discrimination abilities, their touch discrimination abilities seem to improve. So this would be an experiment. Imagine yourself in the experiment. You go into the experiment and you are asked to touch some very kind of, kind of subtle sort of differences between things that are touching you. And I won't get into too much detail here, but these are a different type of touch test. These are not like Braille or anything like that. This is a kind of touch test they often use to test old people as well. They use either that 2-prong thing I talked about with that plug, or that they do is they take these like little plastic grids and kind of gently apply them to the finger. That's what this is showing right here. So they're applying a little plastic grid gently to the tip of the finger. And the job of the patient, the job of the subject in this experiment, is to say whether this grid is being applied to their finger kind of vertically across the finger like this, or horizontally across the finger like that. And the question is, how much pressure do they need to apply until the patient or subject can say, oh, yeah, I can feel that now. That's going across my fingertip. That's going horizontally across my fingertip, or that's going vertically across, up and down on my fingertip. Okay, so they'll do that first. They'll have you come in and close your eyes and just test that. And then by kind of measuring how much pressure it takes, they'll have a measure of how sensitive your sense of touch is. Cool. Then you sit there, okay, in a normal laboratory room for 3 hours. And then they, at the end of the 3 hours, they test the exact same thing again, right? And what they find is even after that little deprivation, okay, that much deprivation, okay, there is an enhancement of your touch sensitivity. You are now more quickly able to say that it is going vertically across or up and down on your finger versus horizontally across your finger with less pressure applied. So your touch sensitivity increases, okay, by virtue of just being blindfolded for 3 hours. Now, again, you're not touching anything. You're not during that 3-hour period. In fact, I think what they do is they make sure everyone's hands are just kind of faced up. You know, people sit in a chair with arms. They just have their hands facing up. They say, don't touch anything. You know, just, you know, we don't want you to stimulate your fingers in any way. Just sit there, listen to a podcast, talk to your friends, whatever. Just don't use your hands. Don't use your fingers. Okay. So there's no experience occurring to improve that discrimination by, you know, touching things again and again. This improvement in discrimination is all induced by the blindfolding. And yes, they then image people. They, you know, look at see what the brain's doing, and they do find that when they do that touch discrimination task at the end, towards the end of being blindfolded for the 3 hours, they do find that the visual brain areas are now getting involved with that task, okay, which did not occur before. So again, another neat demonstration of this kind of, you know, cross-sensory compensation that the visual brain's saying, hey, I'm not doing anything, I want to help out. And yeah, it does help out even after 3 hours of blindfolding. That is tremendous. I mean, that's something that, you know, we never thought occurred. We thought if there was compensations, it was with the early blind or later blind, but certainly one needed to really have lost a lot of their vision to have this. So the idea here is that the brain is kind of ready to kind of swap its functions. You know, the areas are ready to swap their functions, you know, readily in order to help, you know, with other sorts of things. And in fact, you know, there are instances, everyday instances, where it's thought that our visual brain actually does help with touch. So this idea, and I remember talking about this in the very beginning of the class, I said that you know, historically we thought there was a visual area and a hearing area and a touch area and all this sort of stuff, that's actually being reconsidered now. And this is a really good example of this. You know, we do know that a lot of vision does happen here and that sort of thing, but that visual area seems absolutely prepared to help out with the other senses. And it seems to do it even in normal conditions. We do know that if people are touching things for precision, so maybe this is, I think, probably the most intuitive example here, where this image here is being shown of somebody reaching into their pocket and maybe pulling out a key. So, you know, sometimes when I come back home and it's dark out and the, you know, lights are off, no one's home, no one's turned on the you know, outdoor lights, so it's completely dark. What I will do is when before I pull out my key, I will reach in my pocket and I will feel for the correct key, right? You know that keys have different shapes depending on if it's your front door key or your office key or your car key and all that sort of stuff. And we can do pretty well with here. You say, yeah, that's my car key, and you can imagine, you know, it's kind of safe to do that, so you don't have to, you know, kind of fumble around with things if you can feel it, and people can do this. And in that context, that type of context, I should say, it is known that people's visual brains actually will be involved when it comes to fine-grained spatial touch, finding objects by touch. A key is a great example. Being able to feel the, you know, the shape of your house key versus, I mean, your car key is too easy because car keys are so dramatically different now. Maybe your house key versus your office key, or your front door key versus your back door key, that sort of thing. And you're doing it without looking, okay? So there's no visual stimulation about that. The act of touching that for discriminating those sorts of objects, those sort of keys, is probably using your visual brain area to some degree. It's thought that occurred. That's been shown in the laboratory. So it's really the case, not like, you know, there's a complete change of the visual area. In fact, the visual area can help with touch Even without visual deprivation. With visual deprivation, it's going to really help with touch. But even without visual deprivation, sometimes, you're still able to, your eyes are open, you're probably, seeing shadows, if nothing else, you're still detecting light. Your visual brain area can help you with touch to that degree too. And that's been shown with both imaging evidence, as well as this great transcranial magnetic stimulation evidence that, you can have people do something like this in the laboratories. They have to feel keys maybe, or feel, subtly different objects that, maybe they have 2 humps versus 3 humps on them or something like that. Maybe, paintbrushes that have, long versus shorter bristles or something like that. We're talking about finding the discrimination. It's something that's doable, and it's thought that as you're doing it, fMR shows that your visual brain areas will get involved, showing that people's visual brain areas are involved in that kind of fine discrimination. You can then use your friend the TMS and break the visual areas just temporarily and show that it's much harder to find your keys if your visual cortex has been partly shut down. Even though it's not a vision task, it is a touch task. So it suggests that yes, even when we're not blindfolded, our visual regions will sometimes help us with fine touch discrimination. So what the take home is from all these slides so far on touch really is this: that cross-sensory plasticity, cross-modal plasticity, cross-sensory plasticity, the same thing, is a strategy for all brains. It's not just John Bramblett. It's not just Daniel Kish. They're going to show a dramatic cross-sensory plasticity for the obvious reasons that light isn't coming in there. It's not just the sensory impaired, though. We can be blindfolded for 5 days. We can be blindfolded for 3 hours. And even when we're not blindfolded, our visual brains can help our touch brains. And as you'll see, this works the other way between the sensory regions of the brain as well. Okay. All right, it's a couple of minutes early here, but I think that's we can stop. Any last minute questions before the exam? Anything at all? All right, well, good luck everybody with the exam. I think you'll find it very straightforward. Do study. Make sure you're able to answer the 60 questions in the 80 minutes, but I think you'll do just fine. Okay, good luck everybody, and we'll see you Tuesday.